So for the last 3 years I've been the Vice President of the Court of Appeal Criminal Division. This means I'm based in the Royal Courts of Justice, and working under the Lord Chief Justice I run the Criminal Court of Appeal. So I go back a long way. I first became a lawyer nearly 45 years ago, and the differences between the mid-1970s and now are simply extraordinary. When I first came to the bar, there was, and this is perhaps being generous, a mix of attitudes on the part of those on the bench, as one could perceive them to be, as regards the sexuality of individuals. I encountered quite a lot of hostility, as well as a lot of friendliness and kindness. But there were too many judges back then who clearly found it a very difficult, and I think for some of them rather unpleasant, issue. That persisted for quite a long time, but by the time I was appointed as a High Court judge in 2002, things had started to change very, very considerably, and now the position is beyond all recognition in comparison with how it was back then. It's a rather difficult question, that, for me, because of the particular position that I've had. Back when I applied to be a recorder, which is a part-time judge sitting in the Crown Court, back in 1994, I was the first individual that the Lord Chancellor's Department had to deal with who was openly gay. So there was no one who had gone before me who had applied for a judicial position who was out. It was an extremely difficult experience, in that I had just been given silk, so I'd become Queen's Counsel, and the normal process for appointing recorders was put to one side, and I was confronted by a special panel of 5 men in suits who then sought first to dissuade me from continuing with my application, and second, they asked some what were really upsetting and quite troubling questions about my personal life, and indeed the details of my personal sexual life. That was at the time very upsetting. In a sense, the glorious outcome from it was that Lord Mackay, who was then Lord Chancellor, when he heard of what had happened, he completely stopped that element of the process, reverted to the normal procedures, and shortly afterwards I was appointed as a recorder. So in terms of role models, at the time that I became a judge, in the United Kingdom there simply weren't any for that position. Yes, as I've already indicated at the outset, it was very difficult. The real period of change, certainly as I experienced it, was between 1994 and 2002. So in 1994 it was still then quite grim, but by the time I applied to be a High Court judge in 2002, as I perceived it, the attitudes had completely changed, and the then Lord Chancellor, Lord Irvine, and the Permanent Secretary, Sir Hayden Phillips, could not have been more welcoming, and couldn't have made it clearer that my sexual orientation was really completely irrelevant. And I would want to stress that my experience now of being a judge who happens to be gay is that in one sense it is truly and completely irrelevant. that I long ago ceased to detect any kind of prejudice or resentment or difficulty on the part of any of the other judges I've worked with over really the entirety of the time that I've been a member of the senior judiciary. In one sense, it's really to say that now I don't think there's anything to worry about at all. I think it has faded completely. Not only, no, it's more than faded into the background. It has completely disappeared as an issue. So my advice would be that it simply isn't something to be worried about at all. And it's not only just a question of if you keep your head down, then it's not going to matter. It is that if you are either quiet about it or you make it clear to your colleagues, either way, it just doesn't matter. So I only, in a sense, have positive thoughts to share, rather than giving advice as to cautionary steps that need to be taken. Well, I of course am very much aware of it. I have seen the programme of events. It looks absolutely fantastic. I have to confess, I'm afraid, that I'm extraordinarily busy and have not been able to participate at all, but I think it is a really, really good idea and a really good programme. Tongue-in-cheek, my inspirations have been Alexander the Great and Hephaestion, and Achilles and Patroclus. Being more serious, I would say my great standout icon was Harvey Milk back in San Francisco in the 1970s. I think the courage that he showed, the political skill that he displayed, and the way in which he managed to get things changed by sheer force of his personality and the way that he applied himself, together most awfully with the circumstances of his death, mean that he stands out, I think, in a way that no other gay figure in the last, well, certainly the 20th and the 21st centuries so far. The event that I think as a young man made more impression on me than any other were the Stonewall riots in San Francisco in the early 70s. So I was then in the process of leaving school and going to university, and although of course I don't condone violence, the strength of feeling and the way that people were prepared to come out on the streets to be counted then in the face of a really considerable amount of oppression by the authorities really made a deep and lasting impression on me. And I think more than anything else made me utterly determined to be frank and honest about who I was from my sort of early to mid-20s onwards. It really had a very, very profound effect on me. I think that there was at one stage, I think, something of a sense that once rights had been won to a very large extent for gay men and lesbians, or if not won completely, at least matters had improved, that was then the end of the story. But it's so clearly isn't and hasn't been, and that indeed, as the acronym by the number of letters in it reveals, I think society as a whole has continually got to be responsive to new needs on the part of people living in this country in terms of what they need to be recognised as to who they are and their identities. And I think that particularly people who are of an older generation, they really do need to spend time understanding the circumstances that are confronting people who are facing some kind of discrimination that historically has not really properly been recognised at all by society. So that is, for me, the standout change that I hope will happen in the coming years.